so thank you for being here. I know it's really close to lunch, but we have a really exciting panel for you guys. So the theme is like pretty broad, blockchains today and tomorrow, but I think we have a really good mix of panelists to talk about various perspectives within the blockchain space to understand what are the shared assumptions versus the different assumptions that kind of manifest different ways in which a technology is going to kind of be adopted. So why don't we just get started by like a quick intro on what you work on and why you work on that.
All right. Hello again. I'm James Lopp, CTO of Casa, where we are really focused on helping individuals be sovereign within these systems, and that extends everything from private key management to running nodes, helping them be able to more easily navigate these systems without having to scale all the technical hurdles of understanding all the complexities of the systems.
Yeah, I'm Tomer Afek. I'm the co-founder and CEO of SpaceMesh. And we started SpaceMesh when it was clear that proof of work is not incentive compatible and people with a lot of money can get reach fast on that network, and we were hoping to achieve a better solution. And we're now implementing the work of Professor Tal Moran, which is a combination of a DAG with proof of space-time, which delivers a mathematically proven incentive-compatible protocol, which I hope will sustain fairness better and allow people at home with not a lot of money or fancy equipment to participate and be active, as opposed to this notion of super committee of mega nodes, whether it's 21 or 41 or even 700. I'm hoping for people to be able to really participate at home. And if you want, that was the original vision of Satoshi, and we're trying to iterate closer to that. Thanks.
Thank you for inviting the discussion, John. I do three things. First and foremost, I love to share experiences and gain experiences from communities and forums like this. It takes a lot of energy from all of us, and I think it's a great mind meld. Second thing I do in my day job is, as co-founder of Beyond Protocols, is to build protocols, build products. And the third thing I do as founder of Digital Twin Labs is how do you take the solutions through consulting engagements strategically from strategy all the way to implementation, take those products, take those protocols into a solution and a chain that can be absorbed by clients and by industry.
Hi, I'm Jake Kwan, and the co-founder of Tendermint and the Cosmos project. I'm mostly technical, so I've been programming for over 12 years professionally, primarily in the Bay Area. And what I care most about is good software, modular architecture, good protocols. So that's what we try to do in order to create a scalable token economy.
Perfect. So this is why I'm so excited about the panel. We have somebody that believes in like Bitcoin and proof of work, we have proof of storage and time, IoT, hybrid architecture, and proof of stake. So like it's very rare that we can do have this mix, but also have like cordial conversation and
space-time, like
space-time, right? So why don't we talk about basics? Like what is a blockchain for, and what is it not for?
I mean, I think the real value is as a coordination mechanism, if we're just speaking extremely generally. Creating some sort of shelling point around which people can join this organization, which is a completely new structure that we're still trying to understand, but creating a protocol which you could describe as a language, right? So we're basically saying, there is a problem that exists out here, and we believe that there's a group of people who can create value by basically being able to speak the same language so that they can interact with each other economically and solve some other problem, which may be disintermediation, getting rid of third parties, allowing people to directly interact with each other, and just creating a more robust system that is easier for people to join and maintain. The result of that, of course, is that there's probably a million different problems out there that could be improved with systems like this, where we can no longer rely upon gatekeepers and middlemen. And that's, I think, the result of why we've seen this incredible blossoming of hundreds, if not thousands, of different blockchain-based projects, because everyone is trying to apply the technology to as many problems as possible so that we can really create a revolution.
Yeah, that's basically it. I mean, talking once after such a great answer. I think, my humble opinion, blockchains are not good for most of the things people think they're good for. They are good for when there's a massive distrust between the parties which needs to be resolved. So international something, that's the reality, but what's more important than that is that blockchain points towards values and directions which potentially can, be implemented in a bunch of other ways, but lead to a less permissionless, with people that are able to participate, less prejudice, and less sort of all this good stuff, which are value-based, and we should all be looking for this everywhere we go, and not only inside what's blockchain actually used for.
Right, and I think most of us in the room actually agree with the overall ethos of disintermediation. But let's be concrete. What do you think is a really bad idea on the blockchain? Like you said, there's a lot of bad ideas that shouldn't be on the blockchain versus ideas that should be. Can we be concrete about those examples? Any of you guys, by the way?
I don't want to talk in particular about a company that has a bad
Not company, but
like
application, right?
Well, it's what is the value of the particular interaction that you're trying to do? Ultimately, I don't think it's up to us to judge what is good and bad. I believe the market is going to figure that out. But there are certainly incredibly inefficient uses of blockchain. Putting lots of data onto a blockchain that you want as many people as possible to participate in. That's when you get into a lot of these scaling arguments, and what should be the resource cost from a technical standpoint for someone to join and interact with one of these systems. It's very difficult to create hard absolute metrics because everyone has different incentives and different levels of wealth. And we had a great conversation earlier this morning about trying to figure out what is fairness, and how do we create equitable, fair systems that as many people can join in as possible. But ultimately, with any of these networks, they run on real resources, and the fact that nobody controls the network means that you can run into very difficult, contentious issues around how those resources get used and allocated, and who you might be disenfranchising by creating too much load.
Yeah, totally. And I'd love to talk about fairness later in the panel, but just maybe to go to Jay or Guri, what do you think blockchains are for? Is it money? Is it decentralized internet? What gets you excited?
Yeah, I think recently we've been hearing a lot about creating a world computer. I think Ethereum certainly took that narrative, and there are many offshoots that are trying to create a distributed computer. But for me, the reason I'm interested in the blockchain is ultimately because of something a little more concrete. It goes back to the original ethos and the purpose of Bitcoin, which is creating an alternative. Well, Bitcoin wanted to create an alternative payment system, but I think broadly we can create an alternative financial system. So that's what I mean by the token economy. In order to do that, it gets a little more into politics and decision making and governance as well. So I'm also interested in solving the problems around how to collectively make decisions so that we can coordinate at a social, societal level from a large scale to small scale in order to have, starting with good fiscal policy, alternative monetary policies, but ultimately leading to a broader spectrum of decisions around, the various questions around sovereignty, really. So it's creating, for me, blockchains is about bringing liberty and freedom to the individual so that we can choose what kind of system we want to live under and support.
Totally agree with that. Let me just build an orthogonal dimension to your description, Jay. I'll prime this for you to visualize, right? See, the way I look at blockchain, you can sort of, I'll give you the first two through layers of this tree, and then you can parse it out further. At the topmost level, to me, blockchain is about governance, right? Nothing else. You come down a few layers, and everything else falls underneath of governance. Excuse me. And if I were to just tease you with the next layer of definition of granularity, under governance, to me, under governance comes trust. Under governance also comes incentive alignment. So to me, if I were to give you a short answer, blockchain most importantly is about governance. Then it's about trust, and it's about incentive alignment. Now, underneath of that, it could be about a centralization versus decentralization, and actually I look at it as a spectrum. And it could be around crypto economics, crypto tokens, and then that has its own, it's a technique that feeds into the incentive alignment description of it. Far more discussion and elaboration to it. That's gone in a nutshell for me.
Yeah, cool. That's really helpful. So why don't we talk a little bit more about, like, we talked about why you're working on the blockchain, what kind of mission does it stand for, but I'm also curious, when you wake up and work on the problems that you're trying to solve, what is the vision of the future that you actually have concretely? Like what changed in 5 years, 10 years from now? And tell us a little bit more about that vision, and tell me from your gut, what time frame are you working towards? Is it 2 years, 5 years, 10 years, 50? Like tell us a little bit more.
I mean, I'm in this for the long run. I think for a number of reasons, both technical and social. This new type of ecosystem and paradigm is going to take a while to really get mainstream adoption. I mean, we have a lot of technical issues around security that we need to worry about and really solve for the average person before they're going to be able to operate in these systems without having to learn a lot of things. But really, it was the same thing with the internet. The internet didn't get adopted overnight. We had to build a lot of layers of abstraction on top of it to make it easier for people. But also, when I talk about the paradigm shift, we are changing a lot in terms of what is required in terms of personal responsibility. And so when we're changing from a system of trusted third parties and middlemen who are specializing in helping us basically coordinate different aspects of our lives, we're changing to one where we're taking on a lot more of that responsibility and managing our own private keys, our own assets, our own smart contracts, what have you. This is something that requires a change in mindset that may or may not be possible for a lot of people. I think it's more interesting when you think of it from the standpoint of the fact that now the children that are born today are born into a world where they're going to grow up learning that they have a choice in different systems, and hopefully they will be able to adopt and adapt to that a lot faster. But it may very well be that older people who were brought up in a different mindset may never make that switch.
So for those children, how would their life be different? Like, is it because they don't go to Bank of America? Is it?
Yeah, I mean, it's the choice, right? Is that younger generations are already adopting technologies that a lot of us in the room probably aren't even aware of or don't have time to get into. But I think a really good example is that now, especially with these permissionless technologies, they don't care how old you are. They don't care where you are geographically situated. We will expect to see children growing up and using tokens and using crypto assets as part of their daily lives because there is no gatekeeper that can stop them from getting into these systems and using them. And so I think that that will be the main difference, that they'll realize that they've been using these systems potentially for years before they may even be able to get a bank account. And it may very well be that someday the children that are growing up now may go to get their first bank account, their first loan, whatever, and they may be horrified by the process that they have to go through to get through those gatekeepers. And just understanding they have a choice may mean that they decide to choose to use these other systems preference.
And just to tie it up, how many years are you envisioning this?
Yeah, I mean, I think it's decades, if not generations.
Okay.
Fairly slow process.
Cool.
Yeah, this is actually my favorite question. I have so much to say about that, but I'll try to be super quick. I think besides introducing selection, there's another important thing now philosophically about blockchain, and that is there's, if you will, a current monetary systems, there's the most profit point, and there's like the most honest or fair or value-based point, and they're not the same point, right? So are we heading there or are we heading there? So most of us are heading somewhere in between. All of us are lying about where exactly are we and trying to pretend we're less towards the money than we actually are. And this creates a culture of, pretending, a culture of not saying the exact truth, a culture of a bunch of things. So if you can put those 2 points together, say, I don't know, I'm going to fight global warming and I'm going to tokenize it, and in a sense, if global warming becomes a problem and I have the solution because I've been researching, then I am a billionaire now or something like that. That makes perfect sense to me, and I think what's even more important than that is that on the daily interactions between people, they will say what they mean what they say, do what they say and mean, and that will definitely change a lot of our ability to work with each other towards a goal. So the togetherness aspect of this is important. I think the other thing I want to say about what I hope the future will be is, to use the same old word called meritocracy, which essentially means that people will be evaluated based on their real talent and not some man-made borders or any other bullshit which isn't relevant to actually the talent. And last, I think, is about allowing people to get back in the game easily, which is so critical and so not existing today. So if you have done a mistake as a kid, potentially, you're blocked out of some stuff which will forever not allow you to show your talent. Or so again, and you have 50 years to live. So what do you do with your life? The idea is that to Jaz's point, there's a lot of suffering in the world, and a lot of the crime and the evilness we're seeing is a result of people really suffering. And if we could give them a better alternative, a decent alternative to make money, despite the fact that prejudice system blocked them out, and we could potentially even see less of a crime and more of a meritocracy as we advance in life, and that's a thing to live for, no doubt.
Yeah, no, I think that's a really good point. I think that I was just reading a book about how we're in this T-junction era of we had central banks taking on the role of the kind of economy's growth. And we either have to choose either going towards more centralization, decentralization, and I think that what it means is like when you have disintermediation happening, there's only 2 things that can happen. More of that role of the disintermediation has to go to the people that are participating, or somebody else is taking that route, and I think that's a really important point. Jay, Guri, how about you? What do you think about time frame and why these technologies that you're working on today, like how will that change the future?
Yeah, okay, it's a pretty complex question, right? Because on the one hand you have the maturity of the technology and accessibility. On the other hand, you've got global politics coming into play. I'm hearing more about a global sovereign debt default, which it sounds extremely scary, but it's true that people are talking more about it because these countries are getting into too much debt, and it's entirely possible that maybe the dollars or bonds or the currencies that we take for granted today may not work within the next decade or 2, so within a generation. And certainly within a few years, we may see a large-scale recession. In some countries, it's already the case. Like you go to Venezuela, for example, there's mass chaos. There's various countries where people are fleeing from chaos. It's just that there's not enough of the technology being mature enough and accessible enough. But if they were, people would be using them to coordinate to solve problems that they need to solve for their survival. And it's also true that today, because Bitcoin and all these systems exist, for some people, they are relying on it already. So it's already here. It's just a matter of how distributed, it's not evenly distributed, it's not as widely used, but it's growing. And so I think that the time scale may be just a decade or two that we'll see some major movements and innovations that will cause massive adoption of these technologies. It's because we have to provide an alternative because we're entering this phase where it's needed. So I think it's on us to make sure that it is created in a responsible way.
That's a really good question. Like, how does the world change when people now have an escape hatch? They can escape from poor government policies, poor monetary policies, really the things right now that are trapping people who are stuck in certain jurisdictions. What happens now when technology can free them from those shackles? I think that is what is potentially going to have a great global impact, even at the nation-state level, right, is when nation-states may have to compete more against each other because they're not able to control the citizens and their lives as well as they have in the past.
I mean, these nations, these countries are like ultimately run or captured by corporate interests that have a for-profit motive, but ultimately the people, we all kind of want the same thing, right? We want peace. We want to be left alone. We don't want someone telling us what to do. We want the environment to be good. We want the air to be clean. So it's really on us to coordinate to solve these problems because we know now that capitalism doesn't quite solve it. Right? So how do we do that? It's really
common good doesn't make profits right now, and that means that it's sad and neglected, and nobody cares about it.
Who doesn't make profits?
Common good, everything common good. So the air, the pollution, everything.
Yeah, so
no business model, no people, no action.
Yeah, so I think this is really similar to kind of the earlier conversation that we had, but before we get too philosophical right now, so I think a good way to pipe this into a concrete conversation is what are the assumptions that you have about the world or this technology that make you believe that this vision of the future is going to happen or is good? And let's say 50 years from now you're actually wrong. What was wrong about your assumption? Like, could you share a little bit of that assumption based with the audience?
Well, I mean,
Maybe, can we start with Guri actually?
Yeah, sure.
All right. I think the way I look at it is we clearly have a movement afoot for the first time in the history of any technology movement. And it is happening not through standards and enforcement. It is also not happening through any invention handed out to society and innovators like DARPA or cellular, all of which came from the Department of Defense in the US. This is organically grassroots, though there's anonymity behind its real origins. The evidence is clear that we are poised for an opportunity to change a lot of things in a lot of dimensions, all that has been discussed philosophically and otherwise. That's one end. So the analogy I use is that of a pendulum. We have to rebalance the pendulum, and the pendulum swung in all the directions and the ways that we just discussed. And in rebalancing the pendulum, I will try to strike the balance that I don't see the entire notion of centralization disappearing from the planet, right? I don't see the entire world of systems and transactions and data moving over to the blockchain, right? I think we'd be kidding ourselves if we look for that kind of a future. I come from a legacy of enterprises where, aside from the philosophical discussion around centralization, what is more important architecturally is fit for purpose of workloads. And what kind of workloads and what kind of data can fall on what kind of, can superimpose on what kind of infrastructure. So it's for the first time that we now have a spectrum of an infrastructure and associated governance and social impact and ethics arising from that. It's for the first time that we have this portfolio of infrastructure on how to deploy our applications. And to me, that's a huge, huge opportunity that we are presented with and have a shared opportunity as well as a responsibility, I might add.
Yeah, absolutely. I think that concept of a pendulum swinging back and forth throughout history towards centralization, decentralization, and all the various associated concepts is really like it's a framework that keeps on coming up. So I think it's a good one to kind of underline. But I'll just throw out another kind of assumption out there before Jay, Tomer, Jameson, you go, which is, for example, one of the reasons why I work on blockchain technology is that I think that there's a fundamental issue with the level of wealth inequality in the world today. And this is not like a political statement where you're to the right or to the left. I just think that fundamentally, if people, there is a level that exists at which if the people that are participating don't own enough of it, it just becomes less stable. And if blockchain technology or this ethos doesn't pan out, then my assumption that inequality matters would have been wrong. So like, maybe like, can you work off of that to like work on more assumptions about being right or wrong, re blockchain?
I couldn't agree more that essentially inequality is the biggest illness of our generation. I think we've been promised, you know, growth and booming economy at the price of inequality, and money was supposed to somehow trickle down, and I think it's now clear that the growth is stagnated. Actually, my kid will have less of you know, standards of living than I had, and this is the first time this is happening. So I have better than my dad have better than his dad, but now we're going downward, so that's a good indication. And so rather than getting, you know, booming economy at the expense of inequality, we got the inequality with no boom. And I think this heads, unfortunately, like just said, into a conflict zone where we might see it get worse before it gets better. But for me, personally, the mere fact that we're talking about inequality here and making this a priority or emphasizing that a solution that minimizes the entire suffering is what we should all be pursuing is something that I think is a big breakthrough. And I don't think even if it will go back and forth, but it will not go back to the point where we say, yeah, inequality, we don't care about that so much. It'll work itself out. So just want to second that.
So I believe that what we need is, it's called creative destruction. It's creating something new and casting aside something that is putting us down. And I believe that blockchain technology can enable this because it's about open, permissionless innovation that solves some of the problems of centralization and capture. And because it's open and decentralized and transparent and permissionless, and it's so easy through the internet to create new experiments, I think this is the platform for creating this this new wave of creative destruction and creating a new foundation. Ultimately, when people are given the choice, if people have the freedom, then they will not choose a system that has so much massive inequality, because who would want to support that? I mean, if the people who have the massive wealth would want to, but the vast majority wouldn't. So the coffee shop that you go to where you pay your coffee, they would accept coins that they believe is morally more aligned with a more equitable world. So through freedom and liberty, I believe we can arrive at a better balance.
Yeah, I like where you were going at the end there. Like, equality and inequality is a very tricky subject because you can approach it from so many different ways. In general, I have not seen any solutions, nor do I really believe that there's necessarily a good way to get the result of equality of outcome in any of these systems. I think the more appropriate way to approach them is what you were saying is it's more of equality of entrance and equality of use of the systems. Is the freedom and the choice to decide for yourself, without having to go through gatekeepers. So whether that means there's a multitude of different blockchain platforms and systems and currencies and whatnot to choose from, I think that even just stepping back and looking more at it from the standpoint of the internet has reduced the barriers for education. It has reduced the barriers to start a business. And now that we have these crypto networks, people who have a small amount of skills or put in the time and resources to educate themselves can now create businesses, even create entire new networks and economies that can run parallel to the existing system and do not necessarily require interaction or permission from any of the existing systems. So, the hope that I think a lot of us have is that the freedom for people to move about this really new economy will result in greater equality of access and hopefully, eventually greater equality or greater opportunities resulting from that. But kind of the result of the fact that none of this is controlled by anyone means that I don't think that we can sit here and necessarily guarantee that the world will become a better place. I think it's just a grand experiment that we've never been able to run before, and we're hopeful that the outcome will be better.
And what do you have to assume about the world, either people or the way that we organize, for this to come true or not true?
I want to make an important distinction between sameness and fair and equal. Equal and same is very different in my opinion. And expecting all of us to have the same outcome is ridiculous, and just nobody's ever targeting that. No more, I think. There was some attempts in the past where it utterly failed. I think what you need to understand when you approach this, nobody's promising anything, I couldn't agree more, but equality and opportunity means that I stand a chance to be proud of my achievement. And this pride is what we're looking for. We're not looking to give me money after the fact again so I can, buy food. This is not, I need to feel the pride of somebody who's living properly, right? Following his dreams and getting satisfaction from it. So having more and more people deciding to try this route of actually pursuing an opportunity that they like is a future which I am willing to, aim for. No promises, but working hard and with the rationale that supports this, that situation will get better if those systems will be permissionless and trustless as they should.
Well, the assumption that I make is that the vast majority of humans are good, decent, moral people who don't want to hurt other people. There are, of course, conflicting incentives that happen that sometimes cause people to want to do one thing that is good for them and not for others. But I think that what we're trying to do here is build collaborative projects that are trying to solve problems. And the assumption is that there are a lot of people out there who have common goals and they want to work together and they want to build things rather than destroy. And the entire reason that we have governments and law enforcement and all of these systems is not because most people are bad and greedy and want to hurt people for their own good. I think that it's only a tiny fraction of people who are like that, who are cancerous and toxic and poisonous to society, and that unfortunately the response that as our economies and as our societies have grown and evolved over the years, I think that we've had to put far too much resources into fighting that tiny fraction of people because of the damage they can do. But with these type of systems, we can basically build them in a way that is more robust against those bad actors without having to have bad effects across the rest of society.
Yeah, and I think it's really important to actually have the explicit assumptions around how people will act at scale, right, when the technology rolls out. But just to play devil's advocate, right, of course you can assume that people are good. I also like to assume that people like to be healthy, but I also see people eat French fries instead of eat broccoli, right? So I think, to push back, would it be also to assume that people want to take charge of their destiny? What if people are just lazy?
that is a big unanswered question, and that's why I think that this will take generations to see whether or not we can move society in the direction that people are willing to take on more responsibility. It is, ultimately I think you have to convince people that the value is there, that it is worth them putting in a little bit of effort to manage certain aspects of their lives. It's not going to be the easiest or lowest cost path for a person to switch over to these type of systems, but long term, I think that we can show that we're creating a system that is less risky for people to operate in. Right now you have to spend a lot of time, I think, explaining to people why that is, and I'm hopeful that if these systems continue to evolve, continue to run, and prove that they are robust, if the existing systems then continue having collapses and causing major harm across society, while the parallel systems are more stable, that might be the tipping point that gives them better reputation and results in people wanting to adopt it.
Totally, and I think that's a great segue into another part of the conversation, which is, like, we keep talking about the future of blockchain technology and what's going to happen, but what can it do today? What can it do for a consumer that wants, like, they're bought into the ethos, they want to get involved, like, what can they do right now? And a question for any of you guys.
Learn to code.
Okay.
I do know. In some of these initiatives I've been involved. I'm sure there are data points from all of you directly being involved. There are some real burning problems that are being solved by blockchain today. I think it's well known. I won't claim any direct involvement in this one, except peripheral involvement with the use of blockchain in the Syrian refugee crisis. And if you understand the nature of that problem, and these are social problems. This didn't start with a technology problem. Some of those camps are as big as 30,000, and there are multiple of those kind of camps. And when you get to those kind of sizes of population, you're almost talking about a small township, and you now have to manage those townships that is living in these temporary sheds and tents. And because it becomes a township, it also has its negative characteristics of crime and hoarding and all those kind of things, right? So the blockchain application for that is getting identity through retina scans. It's a separate discussion around privacy. We can have that later. Retina scans, through identity, and by that you now know how much rations, which are constrained and limited, can be handed out to which particular family member and which refugee. And now, because you have identity and information on the blockchain, you can build other use cases and features like not just rations, but did that person commit a certain kind of crime, the political status of that individual, so on and so forth. There are other examples I can go cite, but I'll defer time to some of the other guys to share thoughts.
Thank you. I just think that ultimately, like we were saying, people are good or can be good, and if you give them an opportunity to work towards something that they believe in that will improve the world and not just themselves, but their community, then they will get a sense of purpose, and through that sense of purpose, I think it unlocks a huge potential for people to be interested in actually learning the tools and how to build and how to build community, and of course how to write the software, so that you can control ultimately your own destiny, not just as an individual but as a collective. And so that's what ultimately, for me, blockchains represent. It gives me the opportunity today to work towards a future that I actually believe in, and so that's why I do what I do.
And those points of maximum money and maximum value.
Like, for example, here's something that doesn't even involve money. I'm worried about the environment a lot, and I think about it a lot, and I'd love to see, there's already a group working on this, they're called the Regen Network, but we need more. And the idea is to, on the blockchain, record the state of the ecosystem at a local level, to start recording it at a global level so we can understand the facts of the situation. Where are natural resources being plundered unfairly? And through the incentive mechanism of blockchain, we can coordinate to fund for defense mechanisms for the planet so that we can save rainforests and ensure that people who pollute are held accountable for. And it ties into an economic system, but ultimately it's about having a censorship-proof a ledger that allows for massive coordination and open innovation.
Yeah, and I think that's such a worthy goal for all of us to have in terms of coordination. But like a common pushback for, like for example, the environmental question or the supply chain question, and Jameson, you talked about this a little bit in your keynote, is like, does it have to be on a blockchain? And why or why not?
Just one. I don't think it needs to be on a blockchain, but being on a blockchain, okay, so first of all, there's a massive cost to replication. So you have to think about the cost of replication. It doesn't make sense to replicate everything 1,000, 100, 10,000 times over. That's expensive. But what you get with the blockchain is you know that it's less likely to be captured, right? We see over and over again systems get captured by special interests or people who own it or have the most stake in it. We know now that the blockchain allows us to escape capture. You can hard fork it if you need to, right? It's not owned by someone who can tamper the database. So it's just a better tool that allows us to build the foundation.
Yeah, I mean, it's the coordination issue, but really it's the threat model, right? Is if you're building a system where you're trying to coordinate something, the question is, who is the adversary and how much resources might they be willing to put in to trying to disrupt or capture it? And if you're talking about, huge conglomerations with billions of dollars, or you're talking about nation states that can basically print as much money as they want, that's when you need some sort of system that is sufficiently distributed and decentralized that it can resist that capture.
I think the motivations are what matters here, and the technical solution is of second importance. So I want to share with you super quickly my personal impression of this. I think when I was young, I was trying to make money because that was like a survival instinct and a fear that the system has implanted in my brain. And trust the system, they told me, right? Work hard and it'll pay off. And then there's a bunch of people out there which, we're doing way better than me and they're not anything but honest, and we're trying to make sense of this, right? As a kid, you're trying to make sense of all this inputs that you're seeing. What your daddy's telling you, what reality's telling you, and all that good stuff. Anyways, and now as a parent, I have this opportunity to again look at this perspective of, so you telling me that this person who has no food is that way because he was lazy, right, Daddy? And I am eating all day because I'm working hard, and so further again to the trust in the systems. I think, again, my life got dramatically better once I got rid of that fear and started to pursue things that I love, not for the money, but rather for the impact they can bring. I think everything started to make more sense to me. I'm not a slave of anybody. Nobody is like a slave of me. We're all sharing the purpose. We're all sharing the vulnerability. And we're all, we know why we work so hard. We understand and we can explain it to ourselves in a very articulate way.
Yeah, no, thank you for that. So we have about 8 minutes left. After this last question, we have 5 minutes for questions from the audience as well, so feel free to think about one. So the last question is, I think it's a similar theme, but let's say you are building a product and you can choose to give it to anybody in the world, right? And you can describe that user set to people, right? Like, is it developed markets, frontier markets? Is it rich people, poor people? Is it young people, old people? Like, how would you say, given the needs of demographics that you know today, who are the products using blockchain technology for? And who are they could be for, but maybe not as effective? Maybe could you give one example of very compelling versus not as compelling? For example, the city of Seoul has committed millions of dollars. Where are segments of Seoul where it would be beneficial versus not?
Well, I mean, it seems to me like we're going to see a lot of innovation probably happen within the enterprise environment because they're already high tech. They already have networks in many cases that are semi-trusted. And so I think enterprises are coming together and realizing that they can basically recreate their existing relationships but using this type of technology just to get some more efficiency and better auditability around processes. That's not particularly compelling for people outside of those environments, but there are efficiencies to be gained there basically by automating accounting and accountability and all that stuff. I think the ultimate question is how can we get this technology into the hands of people who probably don't have access to much technology at the moment. It's a lot more interesting when we talk about getting people who may barely even have internet access, much less banking access or access to any number of other services, basically putting a mobile phone in their hands, and now they have access to the entire sum of human knowledge and to a plethora of different services that no one can stop them from using. That is a much more compelling use case, and I'm hopeful that as mobile phone penetration continues to get better and better, that we will be able to reach the billions of people out there who have a lot of economic potential and viability, but are currently cut off from the rest of the world.
Yeah, pretty much the same. I think you promised we'll talk about furnace, but we have unfortunately ran out of time. So my perspective, like say, beauty constitutes art and justice constitute the law. I think fairness constitutes money. So in that regards, rather than trying to debate all the time about what's fair and get nowhere, you can run experiments. And we can implement. So the same way that every piece of art is expanding the concept of beauty, every manifestation of money is expanding the concept of fairness. And I think this is super important to allow everybody to, rather than just provide proof, try, do, focus on doing rather than
BUIDL.
Let me provide two wrap-up thoughts from my end. An imbalance, one focused on something concrete and more to the home of the audience in the ground over here, and the other a little bit more social, if you may. So a burning commercial problem in supply chain and enterprises is when a product is announced, that's one thing. But to actually ship a product is another thing. Everybody understands that. And when you're competing, especially in consumer electronic kind of spaces, and want to respond with shipment after announcement through your supply chain and out to your dealers and retail, think about smartphones, think about Samsung, you want to compress that time and have a very quick response to rivals or advantages over rivals. Samsung, I wouldn't credit this to the initial work that I did with Samsung. Some of you might have heard in my keynote with great previous colleagues. But in contemporary times right now, Samsung is implementing their supply chain for 488,000 tons of air cargo of their LEDs and Galaxy phones on the supply chain, on the blockchain. And they build their own blockchain for that, right? And aside from all the provenance and tracking, it's resulting in 20% cost reduction in shipments and tracking, and also much faster compression in getting shipments out after announcements are made and when product launch is happening. So I'm talking about a concrete example which I think will resonate with the audience over here. Last point, more to the social dimension. I'm of a far less worldview where the world is kind of dystopic. I'm not an economic or a social expert, but whenever I go to panels and I've been on panels or listened to panels at events like the World Economic Forum and others, where some of these kind of discussions happen in more depth and sophistication, the numbers that I look at, you know, longevity of people, they're living longer, they're living healthier. Poverty is at the lowest level in the world. Yes, aside from the refugee problem, you look at food and nutrition, there's plenty in supply. Yes, there are distribution problems. In many aspects, the world actually is a good place. And I see that future to still be quite true, to still come true. Yes, there are problems, but then we live and we have to build around imperfection as well. So I think if we go after certain concrete problems which are happening within enterprises, as well as concrete problems like the refugee crisis, there is a good balance to strike for us as technology. You know, I'm not skilled as a technologist. I'm not equipped to have an equality discussion with any level of sophistication. I don't think I can solve that. And I don't think as technologists, most of us can solve the equality discussion. I can argue that Google came out with a digitally equal product where search became accessible without any charge to anybody, right? In that regard, they leveled the playing field for digital access. But we can argue the other side on what Google has ended up with in terms of privacy. So what it does net out to is what the incentive and the economic model is going to be, whether it is for a tactical commercial solution or it is for a social solution.
Jay, one good use case, compelling use case, one uncompelling use case.
Okay, so this is my personal mission. It's not about the Cosmos network in general. It's not about the company that I work with. But for me personally, what I would like to see is, you're totally right, the quality of living on Earth for all the people is increasing. However, I think that's not inconsistent or exclusive of I believe the reality that we are hitting up against a limit. That the reason why we have a high quality of living is because we are ignoring the externalities of what we are producing, and that all of this is going to come crashing down unless we are more aware of the effects that we are creating around our environment, including desertification, carbon dioxide, greenhouse gases, and overfishing, overfarming, soil depletion. There are people who are trying to raise awareness around this issue. I think I would love to create tools that help them compile the facts so that they are more, that they can be more convincing, and that they can be funded so that they can do the work they need to do to put the word out so that we can start coordinating to avert a crisis.
Thank you so much. Could you give a little round of applause for the panelists, please? So I think we have time for one or two questions. Anybody have a question for the panelists? No? Okay, so they'll be around. Just feel free to grab them after. Thank you so much.